Welcome to Queer Stories of Recovery, Voices from the Margin, a podcast where queer folks in recovery reclaim the mic and rewrite the script. Dr. Danielle Bacibianco, the host of Queer Stories of Recovery, Voices from the Margin, is a queer, sober, academic, researcher, writer, and founder of her previous podcast, Voices from Rock Bottom, as well as the online initiative, Sober Academics. Here on Queer Stories, we tell the stories you won't hear at most AA meetings or academic department meetings. Queer Stories invites guests to speak the truths that both recovery and academic spaces try to polish away. Each episode, you'll hear from queer voices navigating recovery on their own terms, artists, scholars, activists, and friends who are surviving, resisting, and thriving in spaces never built for us. Because recovery is not one size fits all, and neither are we. So settle in. This is Queer Stories of Recovery, Voices from the Margin. In Season 1, Episode 1 of Queer Stories of Recovery, Dr. Danielle Bacibianco and Dr. Bryan J. McCann dive into what it means to be sober in academia, a place where alkogenic culture thrives, from conference happy hours to the myth of the tortured drinking academic trope. Our guest shares how they push back, reclaim space, and rewrite what it means to belong and come out despite the chorus.
All right. Hey, folks. Welcome, friends. Thank you for tuning in to the Queer Stories of Recovery, Voices from the Margin podcast. My name is Dr. Danielle Bacibianco. I'm a queer, sober academic, a writer, and the founder of not only the Queer Stories of Recovery podcast, but also the OG Voices from Rock Bottom podcast. Both have been these really cool, amazing digital storytelling projects. Voices from Rock Bottom actually began as a little bit of a whisper of resistance, and Queer Stories of Recovery is trying to do something in a way that Voices from Rock Bottom didn't. Our goal here is to amplify voices of queer individuals in recovery who have been often erased and silenced by the dominant heteronormative recovery cultures, which we can often find in 12-step programs, and even in the alkogenic norms of academia. So a lot of our guests not only identify as being sober persons in long-term recovery, but also, well, long-term folks in academia as well. And today I'm really excited. I have a guest who is a colleague of mine, Dr. Bryan J. McCann. I'll be introducing a little bit more about him shortly. He'll tell us more about his work and his sort of fields and the stuff that he does, and then we'll kind of go into the interview for today. You can definitely catch out our episodes. Definitely stay tuned on Podbean. We release episodes about once a month, and we have a guest already lined up for episode 2, and I'm very excited about that. And before we get right into it, just a little bit about me. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I do work with addiction recovery rhetoric and community literacy. It is important for me to continue to study and do work that's really rooted in understanding how the stories of recovery are not only told, how they're constructed, and the spaces in which they're told in, and how that's often impacted by power and identity, institutions, and all those goodies. More of that stuff I'll be saving for the book. But, Queer Stories of Recovery really came out of, my work that I have done in my dissertation and a couple of the articles that I've written, and me constantly thinking about how do queer people work to reclaim their narratives of recovery from the jaws of conformity, right? And many folks who identify as queer members or queer people, not only in recovery, often work through many layers of identification. And there's a lot of intersectionalities because we're showing up to these institutionalized spaces where our stories are sanitized by redemptive arcs that have often been demanded by 12-step programs. So Queer Stories of Recovery, for me, is sort of like a way for not only sober persons, but academics to push back against that like performance-driven alkogenic culture that equates brilliance with burnout and visibility with productivity. So hopefully we'll get more into that in today's episode, which I'm so excited. It is episode 1 of the first season of this podcast. And I don't know. I think what Queer Stories of Recovery I think it'll serve as a critical intervention in the public rhetorics of recovery and higher education. And I hope we get to offer other queer, sober academics a space to tell their stories on their own terms. And so I not only introduce Queer Story today as just a podcast, but let's make it a communal act of resistance and reclamation in this digital public space. All right, so let's get into it. We have Bryan here today, Dr. Bryan J. McCann, as our first episode. I had mentioned that the Voices from Rock Bottom originated as a digital storytelling project that began as a whisper of resistance, where individuals shared their stories of recovery in makerspace, right, out of these really institutionalized spaces. And so what this podcast wanted to do is sort of a revamp, is to like take that whisper and turn it all the way up. So can you talk a little bit more about what that phrase means to you, this idea of like taking a whisper of resistance and turning it all the way up?
Hey, first off, thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be part of kind of the inaugural episode of this. Yeah, I think it's important work, and it's particularly meaningful because you're a collaborator and a dear friend, and a comrade. So I'm really excited to get to collaborate with you in this particular capacity. I think maybe something that both kind of academia and recovery spaces have in common, and maybe this isn't too distinct from other spaces, is that, yeah, I mean, resistance often will take the form of whispers. I'm thinking of recovery spaces in particular, and I mean, it's no secret to, I think, most people who understand kind of the broader kind of literature and discourse on recovery in the United States that kind of like prevailing modalities are not always particularly trauma informed, and they're definitely not politically informed, and I think that's true of therapeutic spaces too. They tend to be allergic to politics. And, I mean, I can accept the notion that like an entity such as like Alcoholics Anonymous, which is my primary modality of recovery, shouldn't be taking like public positions on matters of controversy. Like I'm not like hostile to that principle necessarily. But also, and this is largely a function of my experiences as an activist, my areas of research as an academic. Yeah, and someone who just kind of lives in a body in space. Everything is political to one degree or another, right? So, I think the whispering in recovery spaces largely comes from the fact that such spaces are not always, or actually rarely are, kind of open to talking about matters of structural injustice, and exclusion and things like that. There's also kind of like a hyper individualism that I think occurs both in the academy and in recovery spaces, wherein in recovery, for instance, there's often the invitation to like keep your side of the street clean or think about your role in the problem, which is all good practice. At the same time, right? If a woman with literal days worth of sobriety can't find an AA meeting where she's not getting sexually harassed by like 50-year-old men. That's a problem, right? And that is political, and that is relevant to recovery. And it's not as simple as saying like she needs to, figure out her role in it. Like, nah, these like 50-year-old men need to stop being creeps. So I think the prospect of kind of turning what begins as a whisper into something that is more amplified, and louder, particularly in a context like this, I think in a lot of ways also kind of resists kind of the whisper cultures of academia and recovery spaces, right? That in both cases, there is often an injunction to not speak badly of the space, and not to air dirty laundry or what have you. I mean, there are probably people out there in the world who think that me coming in here with my first name and last name and even uttering the phrase Alcoholics Anonymous is in violation of like the traditions of anonymity, right? Which suggests that I should never go out into the world and presume to be speaking on behalf of AA. And to be clear, right, I mean, for for legal reasons, I represent neither AA or the institution that employs me in this case, right? I am speaking on my own behalf. But speaking on my behalf means speaking about my experiences in both recovery as well as academia. But yeah, there's just kind of cultures of alcoholism. And such that really insist on silence. And I think resisting that silence and risking the discomfort of speaking up is really crucial in these kinds of contexts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, and obviously, if you see me not looking at you, I'm making notes, and that's the same thing for our
All good.
viewers too. Like, because I'm just so excited about things that are said and things that are brought up, and you are completely 100% right. And I too, identify with getting sober in AA, and I think what has sort of been indoctrinated is this idea of you know, protect, protect, protect. And the reality is that, one of the co-founders of the institution was very, and Bill W, I'm just going to throw it out because everybody knows who Bill Wilson is, right? Was very much like, hey, you know, there are, um, there are problems. This institution is not perfect. This institution is flawed. We are like any other institution. I mean, he didn't say it in those direct words, but the truth of the matter is that, when an institution wants to keep things quiet, they know that there are issues within it. And one of the most poignant issues that you've brought up is, women who are coming in newly sober, who are vulnerable, and they're entering these spaces and they're really nervous about, you know, I would say like being nervous in mixed company, but also being so vulnerable, they're getting the kindness from people who might have bad intentions,
Right.
and that usually leads to issues of sexual violence, and so forth. I mean, there's documentaries on it, right? And again, like, listen, I'm not a spokesperson for AA. I'm also not a spokesperson for the institution I work for. And like you, hey, this is a risk. I'm being honest, right? I'm going on into the public space and we're having these conversations. But it is absolutely true to what you're saying that not all spaces are open to talking about the structural injustices that are there, despite the issues that continue to arise. And I would think even now more so than ever, the silencing is endemic, right? And I think that leads me to my next question, which is, obviously like, all right, so why is it necessary to create a queer center recovery space like Queer Stories of Recovery, maybe in the podcast format, or for you personally, what does it mean to like be here and to be talking about this stuff as queer and as sober?
Yeah. Something else that kind of occurs to me, and this is kind of a lead into the answer to that question, right? Is that kind of the ways in which recovery spaces also kind of traffic very heavily in powerlessness, right? Kind of this idea that like we need to accept powerlessness, lean into it, which again can be like really valuable and really generative, but the oft uttered serenity prayer, right, which is so common, particularly in 12-step recovery traditions. It does include the other stanza, which is the courage to change the things I can, and then the wisdom to know the difference. And yeah, I think there is sometimes an impulse to kind of like throw up our arms, our hands, and just kind of like, alcoholics are gonna be alcoholics, or whatever it may be in a particular instance. And I think equally important as understanding the times in which our agency is in fact quite limited, and we need to accept that. We also need to be willing to kind of embrace the times when we actually do have power and agency and can do something and can do like the right thing, right? Even if it's uncomfortable and potentially creates conflict. But for with regard to kind of the um, kind of importance of and kind of role of kind of queer voices and queer spaces in recovery. I mean, I would say, I'd say there are two kind of things come to mind. Well, I mean, one is just the fact that, as with kind of any historically marginalized group in recovery contexts, having, enclaves, right? Having spaces wherein we can show up authentically and vulnerably is really essential to recovery. And yeah, for queer folks, kind of, mainstream de facto straight meetings are not always that, right? Whether it's because of, who you desire, or how you desire, right? I think being gay or bisexual is sometimes difficult to navigate in recovery spaces. Being non-monogamous is another instance in which it can be very difficult to navigate recovery spaces. So you know having kind of conspicuous spaces that are accessible, where people can kind of like find themselves, is potentially quite life saving, right? And I think particularly, I got sober in a medium to small size city, but still a city, right? A city, a college town, a state capital. So, there are queer meetings, though I don't really, well, no, there are gay meetings. I don't know if I would call them queer meetings, but there are LGBTQ meetings. And, I've been around long enough that, I kind of know who my people are and where they're at. Right. But, sometimes I think like, if I had not gotten sober as a white guy who, based on just kind of the visible aspects of my personal life passes as straight, um, you know, that made a big difference. But also, like, if I had gotten sober in, a small town, if I was like living in like middle of nowhere, Iowa or Kansas or something like that, right? Where there are less meetings total, but also less like queer spaces, right? So I think some digital resources in particular are, I think, really vital. Um, but another thing that kind of like the lead up to this conversation got me thinking about, and something that I think you and I have explored in some of our conversations and collaborations together is, I think doing kind of queer work in recovery can also kind of call our attention to the ways in which sobriety itself is queer. Right. So, if we take, a relatively kind of broad understanding of what queerness is, which is kind of non-normative relationality, right? To be sober in an alcoholic world, is to relate queerly to social norms. Particularly in academia, but also more broadly. I mean, booze is ubiquitous; it's everywhere. And then also like the cultures that breed all forms of intoxication, compulsion, addiction, consumption, and things along those lines. And, I think bringing kind of a queer lens to bear on recovery can highlight the ways in which recovery can, in fact, be kind of a modality for queer world making, in ways that, also are like queer within LGBTQ plus spaces, right? Because I kind of corrected myself there earlier because, a lot of the LGBTQ recovery spaces I have moved in the past have been misogynistic, have been racist, have been biphobic, and harmful in that way. But then also, yeah, I know I'm not alone in terms of like my own sense of myself as a queer person, um, initially took form largely at gay bars. And and I'm grateful for those experiences in a lot of ways, but yeah, you put in some like insecure queer kid, like in his early 20s, with a penchant for insecurity and self hatred, and put him in a bar full of like horny people and alcohol, then yeah, those things become fused very closely. And in fact, I have in the past heard like queer colleagues kind of make the suggestion that every so often, like professional organizations like the National Communication Association will kind of, ask reflexively, okay, do we like center alcohol too much at our events? Like, do we need to like, and, there has been like some surprising pushback from queer spaces being like, but, the gay bar is so significant. Alcohol is part of who we are. I'm like, I mean, that is a normative script in its own right that, yeah, can have real life and death consequences for people. And, I think another function of queerness is, one's relationship to home is always kind of precarious. And, um, I think to be queer and in recovery, um, invites a variety of different kinds of precarity, in relation to sober spaces, in relation to LGBTQ spaces, in relation to the workplace, and so on.
Well, anyways, you said a lot, but I'm gonna take apart some of the stuff that you said, because I think it's important to really get into sort of the inner workings here, right? And yes, as somebody who is an academic and somebody who goes conferencing and continues doing the thing that we do, um, there are definitely spaces, I would say that, are precarious and also extremely normative, even if they are not in the physical location, but they're sort of like these alternative, like academic spaces, right? Which are like conferences and stuff. And it brings me back to something that you said about, booze being ubiquitous and the fact of like everything happens at the bar, especially as queer folks. And I would even say not queer folks. I came into academia or having already been sober. I was coming up on about 4 years of sobriety when I started the PhD program. I remember just celebrating 4 years. And, I remember, after a class, and it wasn't the end of the semester, but it was, I don't even know if it was like the first week as new graduate students, but there was the bar across the street, which by the way, the bar was named, had gotten so many different names because I had went to that institution as an undergrad, and that the bar name changed and then it became a restaurant and like a sort of Asian fusion restaurant that everybody went to. And I remember being the only one that actually ordered food and a ginger ale. And I'm sitting at a table, which sort of felt like this, I don't know, long table of death where about like 20 people are staring and looking at me. And they're like, oh, you don't want to drink? And I wanted to be like, excuse my French. If I wanted a fucking drink, I would have gotten a drink, right? Like, obviously, like I ordered a ginger ale, right? Like, what are we doing? Drawing attention. And I'm like, yeah, I don't drink. How come? And it becomes this sort of like questioning and questioning. And that leads me to my next question when we'll get there about this idea of like having to like come out not only once in AA, but to also come out in academia, not only as queer, but also as sober. And, I would use like jokes that people say in recovery or in AA, like, I'm allergic to alcohol. If I have it, I break out in handcuffs, and then they just stare at you and you're like, okay, that's not going to work. Let me try something else. I'm like, yeah, I'm sober. I got sober and, I just don't drink. And they're like, you got sober. Like, what do you do? And I'm like, wow, my goodness. And here's the thing, right? We're going to talk about like privilege. There is this definite white academic privilege, which is like I get to have access to everything that's completely invasive and personal and vulnerable to you without you, because I'm the academic, I'm studying, right? So in this moment, it's like they're making themselves believe like, oh, this is productive. This conversation is helpful. It's constructive. And what they don't realize in those moments is that it's completely I don't know, insensitive, unjust, right? Exploitative. And from that moment, just knowing that I was sober. And yes, like, listen, my work is out and about. I am an out queer scholar. I'm an out sober scholar. My dissertation, my research, it's all this is what I do, right? But the exploitative nature of this is that probably a few years after I was done dissertating, defended, graduated, and I was still like sort of working there, adjuncting. I had a tenured faculty member ask me to help another tenured faculty member get sober. And I was like, oh, this is like so not appropriate. So I want to ask you, just like because we're sharing and or maybe commiserating, like how has your experience been, or what did that look like? Not only like coming out again, right, in sobriety, but in academia. But this idea of is like everything still, whether it's queerness or academia, happens at the bar. That sense of community and identity happens at the bar, right? That's that duality. So I would love for you to expand a little bit more about that, what your experience was coming into these spaces.
Yeah, I mean, what's coming to mind kind of maybe the most kind of powerfully is, yeah, what it meant to kind of like come out as sober in academia. And I mean, there's definitely been kind of ways of navigating recovery spaces as a queer person. Also, as a person with like a pretty explicit politics that is pretty central to who I am as a person, I think that's also consequential. But yeah, I mean, definitely, recovery spaces traffic in all the kinds of like normative masculinity that you see in other spaces. So what is presumed about you, I pass in most ways, but in passing also is certain forms of like visibility and masking that can be um harmful and difficult. But yeah, I mean, the coming out journey in academia vis-a-vis my being in recovery, probably has kind of the most kind of conspicuous narrative arc, right? In that, yeah, I mean, at first I was terrified to be kind of open and out as a person in recovery. And yeah, I mean, I think that was for all the usual reasons, right? That there is, immense stigma attached to it. Um, both in terms of like stigma associated with, the implication of being sober is that like you used to be a hot mess who drank too much. So, it invites, you know, potential just imaginings that are really unflattering. And I think also, there are, I think particularly maybe in academic spaces where people, are maybe too smart for their own good, that, are judgmental and kind of patronizing with regard to modalities such as Alcoholics Anonymous, right? It's just like, that it's a cult, or that, there's all these like cheesy, stupid sayings, which there are, to be sure, though they often tend to be resonant and accurate, which makes them all the more annoying when I'm really in my head. Um, and yeah, I mean, for me also, just I don't know, I hyper invested in my kind of brand as an academic, and I worried that kind of being openly sober was gonna compromise that. I'm also, my spouse and nesting partner is also a scholar in my field. So like, my visibility has like very real implications socially and professionally, for not just myself, but like my family, right? So, um, so there's those kinds of questions with regard to the stigma, but also kind of as you're saying, yeah, the socialness of it. My first two conferences as a sober person, I got sober in summer of 2016, and these conferences were consecutive, like October and November, like almost back to back of 2016, right? So I was still pretty fresh, and yeah, probably not even in a place where I was like fully just, where I knew this was going to be a thing I was going to be doing for the rest of my life, hopefully, right? I still had my own questions of like, okay, am I really an alcoholic? Am I going to keep doing this AA thing? What have you? But but yeah, the first conference was like kind of a smaller boutique conference, kind of an invite only one. So it was kind of prestigious. It's my first time being invited to present at the conference. Um, and, and yeah, I mean, when, it's the conference was like at a hotel in one room, it's all plenary sessions. So it like, if we're not watching panels at this conference, everyone's in the hotel bar, right? Doing their drinking. And, I remember greeting a good friend who, as it so happened, years later, himself died by suicide. I remember hugging him and like immediately catching the whiff of the bourbon that was on the bar in front of him, right? And I don't, to my knowledge, he was not an alcoholic. But it was just like from the get go, like I was aware of the alcohol there. I had a colleague, like a senior colleague, notice that I ordered a Diet Coke and was like, "Oh, on the wagon," and I just mumbled something stupid about health, which again is like, you know, none of your business. And then similarly, right, at the 2016 in November, right, at this conference, it was election night. The first night there was election night. So I'm just in this room full of people who study rhetoric for a living, like watching Donald Trump win the presidency. And, everyone else is taking shots. I'm just like, ugh. I mean, fortunately, I still smoked at the time. So I had that as a resource. Um, but yeah, with time though, I mean, I think a lot of it is a function of whiteness, cis masculinity, and tenure. Emphatically, all of those things. And also I think being in a field where, kind of more reflexive moves, are not necessarily like the norm, but are there's space for that, right? That I can kind of write in a voice that is more kind of autobiographical, and reflexive. And, if I were like a STEM person that might look like, yeah, I don't know. I probably couldn't like pivot to be like, oh, I've been studying, hummingbirds, all my life. So let me now study,
Yeah.
alcohol, right? That doesn't work. But, as someone who historically has studied the cultural politics of crime, and then also has had kind of an emerging interest in the cultural politics of higher education, there's actually some cool ways to kind of incorporate my recovery and mental health kind of journey into that, in ways that I think are really generative. Um, yeah, and I mean, for me, and again, in ways that have an immense amount to do with privilege, and job security, it's been net beneficial, right? I mean, I am happier professionally, being out as someone who is sober. And yeah, and I've gotten feedback that it has been meaningful to people, in the past. And but yeah, I mean, the example you give is really interesting, right? Because I still feel like that ask would be inappropriate. I mean, especially now because I'm an administrator, like I'm a department chair, and I don't think I should be offering counsel to, anyone in my department about their drinking problem, um, for a million reasons, mostly that have to do with their safety and their privacy and job security. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I also like I can say no pretty easily if I want to, right? My reticence with my no's are a function of my own kind of neuroses, not a function of, well, okay, if I don't agree to this, if I don't consent to this boundary violation, is my contract going to get renewed, right? Am I going to, get a 8 a.m. teaching assignment? Am I, like there's just a million different ways where like, yeah, I'm relatively insulated. And I mean, another way of looking at that is that is also kind of an opportunity to kind of mobilize that job security and that privilege, right? In ways that, I have like in small ways been able to, for instance, like advocate for the collegiate recovery program, at my university. I have, I know for a fact that people in my field who have hosted conferences, actually the same conference, that was my first sober conference. It's a biennial conference, and the last time it was held, um, some really dear friends were the ones hosting it at our campus, and they told me after the fact that like it's because of you that we did not have an open bar, right? That we had a cash bar because we wanted to make sure we were not centering alcohol in the way that it is historically centered. Which, I mean, I feel bad for the grad students who had to like probably pay an unreasonable amount of money for
Yeah.
the alcohol. But I mean, I do think small things like that do matter for people who, whether they're in recovery or for other reasons, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
don't
mean,
drink.
no, and I'm glad that you said that about like ways that certain organizations and conferences have, worked to counter centering alcohol. I regularly go to and present at C's, and it's a national conference, and usually I bring like either AA meetings, and then I started bringing, as a co-founder of the Sober Academics online initiative, I would like host meetings there, even though we met on Discord. And but last year we did a Sober Academics meeting that was in person, apart from the Discord, and the conference they actually like funded it, and I was really grateful because there was food, there was non-alcoholic beverages, and I would say probably about 10 people came through, and it was really great to like sort of like have like a safe space. And like, listen, it was at the same time that many people were going to the bar. I just wish that like when people who are sober like attend conferences and stuff, like for me personally, like who I struggle with conferences that just prioritize recovery. And I don't think that having that is bad. I think it's like, when you go on a cruise ship, they have like Friends of Bill meetings or Friends of Dorothy, you know? But I think instead of making it so program oriented, I think if we did more of the sober academics or just non-alcoholic social gatherings, a lot more people would come through. I think even hearing the word sober academics, and even just saying like you don't have to be in recovery to come, you can be a non-drinker, whatever spiritual, personal, cultural reasons. I still think there's another like understanding that there is sort of like another institution embedded within the organization of like who can be there and who's allowed to be there and all that stuff. So I know that there are many conferences that are sort of like on the wave of like trying to decenter alcohol, but I still think there's more work ahead of us, which now brings me to sort of the stuff that you entangle about, you know, the definitions of excellence and academic context. 2021, you wrote an article called "Economies of Misery: Success and Surplus in the Research University." You could find Dr. McCann's article online. And you can get it through even through your university library database, and I can definitely share it on the socials as well. But in that article, you share about your personal experiences, with alcoholism, mental health. You examine, narratives about merit and success. You've talked about some of that stuff tying into like this whiteness, masculinity, that. Oh my God, I almost said terror, and I meant to say tenure. Whoa! I mean tenure, not terror, but I don't know, maybe we should unpack that. And I in the article, one of the things that I like is, within the concept of economies of misery, you disentangle anxiety, depression, and substance use, right? As sort of like this byproduct and on the consequences of achieving the university labels. And you did a little bit of touching on that throughout the episode so far, but I really want you to maybe tell us more for those who might not understand the inner workings of, how to strategize and respond to universities' encultured ways of cruelty, to talk a little bit more about like what does that surplus of emotional pain look like in the context of academic achievement? Like if you could really paint us a picture,
Hmm.
what does that look like?
Yeah. So the kind of main impetus for that essay was, this kind of recognition over time that like, and this was one of the reasons it took me maybe as long as it did to get sober, right? Which was, the prevailing kind of professional narrative of the prototypical alcoholic is, professional decline, right? Job loss, showing up drunk, things like that. And that's not what happened for me. Like I got sober in 2016. I got tenure in 2017, I think. Yeah, 2017. So, you know, pretty much everything I did to get tenure, I did in the midst of active alcoholism, right? I like I did not suffer professionally. Um, I suffered in many other ways and caused a lot of suffering in a lot of other ways, but I was shiny, um, and on a professional level, right? And I say that with all due humility, right? I mean, but yeah, I mean, and it was not like a squeaker in terms of my tenure case. Like it was a pretty like slam dunk kind of instance, right? And another thing that kind of like inspired the article was it was relayed to me that an administrator at my university had told a junior colleague of mine that my successful tenure case was going to have the effect of probably like raising the bar in our department, right, for other people. And I just so that kind of got my attention because it was just like I saw like there was a narrative taking shape around my success. And then also I kind of came to understand that actually like my success was not despite my alcoholism and mental illness. It was a symptom of those things, right? It was a reflection of my willingness to pour all of myself into academia, right? To really like, you know, I mean, to use kind of the 12-step recovery language, it was my higher power, right? Or at least my like reputation and my ego was my higher power, in so many respects. So, I started thinking like, what does it mean to think about, things that are generally taken for granted as reflections of someone doing well, of doing fine, even doing great, actually being reflections of the opposite, right? Of someone who is increasingly like dead inside, right? And kind of falling apart. So I started kind of thinking about the language of surplus, in that, I mean, a lot of my intellectual genealogy, in terms of like who my advisor was and the work I've done over the years kind of runs through Marxism, right? So kind of the language of surplus is kind of present in my mind. And, you know, I came to kind of think of this as, the university, both as the specific university that employs me, but also the university kind of as an enterprise, as an idea. And that would include, conferences, journals, books, etc. Right? Um, you know, it extracted value from my self-loathing, from my insecurity, from my alcoholism, from my depression, from my anxiety, right? I was a participant in this, right? I mean, I produced value that then, aided me, benefited me in important ways, but then, yeah, also benefited, the university, right? That's, you're if you're publishing a lot, you get to be like people, the university's going to list you on end of the year reports, or, if you win awards, there's going to be a press release. Graduate students are going to want to come and work with you, so on and so forth, right? And yeah, whenever value is extracted from labor, there is a remainder. There is something that cannot be, used to create value. And, Mike Davis, talks about surplus humanity, right? Those populations who are like so kind of off the grid that they are not even, a population that capital can kind of extract value from. And I think the surplus of kind of the economies of misery I'm trying to kind of conceptualize and describe in this article, it's the drinking, right? It's the suicidal ideation. It's the, um, you know, ugly conflicts at home. It's the like escalating blood pressure, high cholesterol, like all of that stuff, right? Um, that doesn't have a place on the like awards dossier or the tenure and promotion file or the publication. There's no CV section for times I contemplated ending it all. That's not, you know, it's not decorous. It's not professional. It's queer, right? To kind of name that stuff and kind of enact it in public. Uh, so yeah, I mean, the question that the article kind of asks is like, okay, what if we look at this surplus? And I try to make it clear in the piece that the irony is not lost on me that I am like reclaiming a surplus and then putting it in an academic paywalled article that you know did not did not go in my tenure file, but definitely went in my promotion to full professor file. And has has had the effect of, I think, forging and cultivating really powerful, cool connections with people in a variety of professional contexts, right? Um, but yeah, it's also aided me. It also is, you know, and something I've been thinking about a lot, uh, particularly with a piece I'm working on right now, is that that is also, like, deeply connected to whiteness and masculinity, right? Because, I mean, there is, kind of a ready-made discourse for, the, kind of anguished, alcoholic, white masculine genius, right? I mean, the Ernest Hemingways, the Kurt
Yeah.
Cobains, the you know, I have tropes that I can kind of grab onto and kind of align myself with, which, is not the case for other people, other communities, other populations. Like there's and it's not always a good thing, right? I mean,
Mhm.
the fact that there is a romance to my misery, it probably kept me in it a lot longer than I needed to be. But at the same time, right, I'm more legible, right, than, a person of color, a woman or a femme, a more conspicuously queer person, or someone who's addicted to something other than alcohol. Like I'm a garden variety alcoholic. I didn't really play around with much else. So if I was a heroin addict, right, that might be different. Um,
Mm.
but I think, I mean, getting back to the question of like, turning the volume up on the whispers, I think maybe the kind of gesture of reclaiming surplus vis-a-vis kind of the emotional economies of the academy, that is one way of kind of raising the volume.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here and it's interesting because I always feel like when you hear something, even though you've read it and even though you've talked about it, especially because you and we collaborate a lot, sometimes it's like we're hearing it for the first time all over again. And in those moments, I just have these flashbacks to instances and memories of conversations and situations that had happened over the course of, I would say my collegiate, you know, doctorate experiences, and I think back to sort of I mean, you talk about like surplus of suffering, which is like on the one hand, it's like, wow, like you're sober, cool, great, amazing. And then I'm like, wow, I could do something with this, right? Like writing studies, community literacy, like this is
Yeah.
research. I want to do this. Like this is empowering. And then the other side, from peers and even like faculty as a graduate student, there was such a toxic environment and attitude um, that you had mentioned about this like demand for conformity, right? This demand for the chorus. And I just quite never felt like I could live up to the chorus. And I was sort of like indirectly like, that was made known to me. And there were sort of peers that were, like, in the same cohort as me that kind of looked at me like I was immature, that I was never gonna make it, and just by things they said to me or how they treated me. And this is, like, well into, like, my coursework and starting to, like, develop my research, and there was this, very clear, um, I guess maybe separatist attitude, which is like, if you're not one of us, right? If you can't, and you had mentioned it, this, like, the anguished white academic, right? And some of those folks identified as non-white, but but again, we have learned about, you know, you can't break down the master's house with the master's tools, kind of a thing, and embodying that anguished white academic and perpetuating that toxicity and trying to create collective research, imaginative spaces at the same time is kind of oxymoronic, right? So,
Mhm.
and you and I have both experienced that. So, I think that like leads me to this question, like, okay, like this is sort of like a cycle of patterning that seems pretty dumb. Like, what's happening here? Like, so as somebody who is tenured, as somebody who's been in academia quite a while, somebody who's been in academia not sober, who's been in academia sober, like, and being able to study institutions, especially with your research, right? Like, I hear Foucault, you got Marxism, right?
Yeah.
Right? You have all of these, like, we have these ways of understanding and meaning making. But why do you think universities or collegiate institutions still uphold the myth that success is unmarred, even when it's built on this really bad emotional and mental strain?
Mm. Um,
Mm.
yeah, no, it's a fine question that I often ask. I think, yeah, I mean, there's a romance to the academy, I think, for the people who are in it. I mean, there's so many people, you know, particularly disillusioned people, who will kind of say that, like, I thought this was gonna be different, right? I thought this was going to be, better than, say, like, the corporate world or government or, what other kind of career options there are. Um, I mean, in important ways it is, right? I mean, I I I definitely enjoy kind of the privileges of kind of life on an academic calendar and the job securities of tenure and all of that, right? um but I think academia traffics in kind of the same kind of liberal fantasies as other kind of realms of work, of labor, of community, right? And that is this commitment to hyper individualism, um and relatively conspicuous benchmarks too, right? That the thing that's always fascinating, right, is you stick around long enough and you see people who have been around also for a long time, who for a fact have been through some really difficult stuff, who then turn around and are doing the same thing to someone else, right? They are kind of like, you know, they get tenure, they get full, they go into administration or whatever, and suddenly they are kind of participants in the very violence that they experience. And I mean, that's something I'm needing to, like, really be reflexive about now, as a chair. So I think the suffering, the pain of kind of academic labor really becomes its own discourse. Right, and I mean, I've had graduate students, like, say, like, the most disturbing things to me, right, about, like, just this resignation to mental illness, to, like, if you're not depressed, you're doing something wrong. I'm like, no, let's reorient that, right? Um And, I mean, I'm someone who studies popular culture for a living, right? So, there's the kind of like readily available kind of archive of public discourse about academia, typically has professors who sleep with their students, who get high with their students, the backstabbing, the cruelty, all of that stuff. And there's this line in I like a lot of people who try to think and write critically about the university. I'm really informed by the collaborations of Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. And Moten has this like little bit in this interview that's published in their book, The Undercommons, where he talks about how like kind of misery, suffering, etc., becomes this kind of badge of honor, right? That I remember a colleague of mine who he's maybe a couple years, like I'm maybe a little older than him, but not by much. But after that article appeared and we saw each other for a conference, the Economies of Misery article, he made this comment about how a couple years ago when he won an award, someone like made a comment during the business meeting where the award was presented, and it's like, this guy never sleeps, right? And as if that was like a good thing, a positive thing. And then my colleague was like, well, yeah, I don't, and that's probably not good, probably not healthy.
Yeah.
And the you know killing oneself, becomes this kind of way of broadcasting one's rigor, one's value, one's yeah, it becomes the rent one pays to deserve a place at the
Yeah.
table.
Yeah, and listen, just for those who are tuning in, this was a great conversation. I'm sure Brian and I could probably chew
Oh yeah.
each other's ears off all day long, but with the idea that we do have to wrap it up, and to sort of like bring us to a close. Lacey Johnson wrote this really great essay in Tin House about unlikability, and she works with these ideas of like how she's been forced into silence by patriarchal heteronormative mask, right? These like ways of like these forces pushing intolerance. And she kind of like comes to own the fact that she is unlikable, right? And here we are, right? We're talking in this space, we're queering, right? We're not part of the chorus, and it could to potentially put us in this sort of like unlikability, right?
Yeah.
And I think, with that being said, like if okay, to be unlikable means to do the work, right? But what do you hope that listeners of this podcast, or especially particularly today's episode, could take away from the things that we talked about? Like, what would be like one thing that you feel like, you know, not as like a, hey, go out there and, with the protests and the flags or
Yeah.
take down academia, because that's not what we're suggesting here. we, believe, we believe in education and higher ed. But what is something that you hope listeners can sort of take away from our conversation today?
hmm Well, yeah, and I mean, the protesting, the visibility. I mean, those are all going to look different for different people, right? That not everyone can do what I have been doing the past few years, right? And that's not a function of like skill or anything like that. It's a function of a lot of circumstances, right? And a lot of earned and unearned capital that I possess, that kind of allows me to, yeah, like talk openly about being an alcoholic, right? And
Yeah.
so I think definitely, any listener should, be mindful of kind of how they kind of exist in space and operate in space. Um, I mean, I think maybe two things is, be kind of reflexive and mindful just about how your experience is an explanatory tool. That, thinking about what it means to navigate, for instance, academia as a person in recovery. that allows you to see things in a way that no one else does, right? To observe things, I mean, gosh, for instance, like I'm always joking about how like so many of the kind of professional dynamics that I've encountered over the years in academia are basically textbook alcoholic family behavior. I mean, just to a T. So I think that's one, just you know, understanding that your experience is not only valid, but actually like heuristic, generative, illuminating. Um, and then also just like, find your people. And that's not always going to look exclusively like people in recovery. You know, I am active in my local recovery community, and that is a huge, huge, huge part of my life. And social support, and social network, and all of that. But yeah, I don't bring everything to AA, right? And I don't think AA is designed for me to bring everything to it. Or at least I don't bring everything to like the same space in AA, right? There are, for instance, you, Danielle, are probably the person I talk to the most about academia in relation to recovery, right?
Yep.
Because we get it, right? Um, so yeah, but just finding ways to connect with community, like that. I mean, that's at the end of the day what makes or breaks us. Because I'm someone who has a propensity to at times kind of isolate, withdraw, like and whatnot. But no, I mean, I need to I mean, I texted my sponsor today just because there's stuff I'm dealing with, personally that I like I need to talk to him about it. Like I don't want to, but I've got to. and and I think that's also true of these things. So yeah, I think find your people
Well,
and
listen.
uh,
Yeah, no, listen, I'm really glad that you not only are a friend in both of these communities, but you came on today to kickstart this really cool, new, awesome podcast. And I'm not just saying that because I'm the host, but um, yeah, and exactly what Bryan said, like, hey, this is a place, right? Queer Stories of Recovery is a place for us to have critical conversations. So if you want to come on and tell your story, remember these stories that we tell here on this podcast, you're probably not going to hear not only at most AA meetings, but also not at many department meetings as well. So
no.
we try to speak the truth here. So, you know, um, stay tuned. We have another episode coming out in a couple weeks, and that means me and all the forces that be within my computer screen. I always talk about the we. I'm very excited to line up our schedule. If you're interested in coming onto the podcast and you're somebody that identifies as a sober academic and/or a queer sober academic, definitely come on out. We would love to hear your story. Remember that this is a space that we're co-creating because there are many spaces that weren't built for us. And if you want to get in contact with me, generally you can email me at drbacibianco@gmail.com. You can also follow me on all socials at Dr. Prof B, which is DRPROFB. And I will also post that information on the web and all of that stuff. So we're really excited about that. I'm going to edit, I'm going to touch it up, do a little bit of a thing. And one more thing I want to say too is that if you're out there and you are somebody who is sober in academia, there is an online initiative that we co-founded. It's called Sober Academics. You can find us on Discord, and all of that info is also made available on my website, which is drdaniellebacibianco.com, and on the web. So stay tuned with us. Dr. Bryan J. McCann, really happy to have you on today. Hope everybody has a great day. And
Thank you.
Stay tuned for episode 2.
Awesome. Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks.
Coming soon, episode 2 of Queer Stories of Recovery. Voices from the Margin. Dr. Danny B. will go back to the beginning, not just her story, but the story of the next guest, about how queer folks carve out recovery spaces when the dominant culture refuses to see them. They'll talk about resistance, resilience, and the radical act of telling the truth out loud. Remember, recovery isn't just about what we leave behind, it's about what we find and the community we create. Stay tuned for more stories about queer, sober joy and how important it is to reclaim one's voice with as much resistance as refusing the drink.